All right, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about Archean hydrothermal systems, part of a project that I call DAMP, the Dome Anchorite Mine Project. I found that acronyms are incredibly important in astrobiology. So what I'm doing here is characterizing an anchorite horizon at the Dome Mine in Timmins, Ontario. Now, anchorite's an iron carbonate. So as you can see, this is my field site, underground in the gold mine. This is myself and an undergrad assistant. And so presumably, by now, you guys have heard a lot about Archean hydrothermal systems, why they're really interesting, and why carbonates are pretty cool in the context of Mars. So what my motivations behind understanding this system primarily are understanding Archean habitable or potentially habitable paleo environments with applications for interpretation of Martian paleo environments and the search for biosignatures, and then also looking at biomarker preservation potential and detection in ancient carbonates. So the region I'm working in is called the Abitibi Greenstone Belt. This is the largest and best preserved greenstone belt in the world, sorry. And it is right here in northern Ontario and Quebec. And it spans several hundred kilometers across. And as you can see, it is host to multiple world-class gold deposits. So these are primarily hydrothermal, well, they're all hydrothermal pretty much, but seafloor, VMS deposits, and quartz carbonate deposits. So the area I'm working in is right there. So this is the Porcupine gold camp. This is the most prolific gold camp in the world. As you can see, it's kind of your standard, well, for those of you that are geologists, your standard greenstone sequence. So what I mean by that is you've got a series of mafic and ultramafic basalts and sediments that are highly folded. These have essentially come from the seafloor where you had a subduction zone and hydrothermal alteration going on. They've been squished, heated, and pushed up into the middle of Canada. So what I'm looking at right here is this region right here, the Dome Mine. Now the Dome Mine is the longest operating underground mining operation in North America. It's been in operation since 1910. It's what we call a late Archean greenstone-hosted quartz carbonate vein gold deposit. So it's hosted in greenstone basalts, and the gold is in quartz carbonate veins. So this is structurally controlled hydrothermal alteration. So the geologists eat it up. This is the only strat section you're going to see. I'm not going to discuss it too much. What I want to get across is the area I'm interested in is in here, right here in the middle of these 2.7 billion-year-old volcanics in the Hillsdale assemblage here. These are where the anchorite veins are, anchorite horizon, depending who you're talking to. So these are somewhere between 2679 and 2690 million years old, and they're massive. They run 500 meters in strike, 900 meters vertically, and up to 2 meters in width. So that's why they call it anchorite horizon, because it pretty much is conformable between volcanic flows. So it was in place sometime around the time when we had this gigantic sedimentary assemblage, the Porcupine assemblage, which if you can imagine formed in a big basin. So you've got a sub-seafloor volcanics, and then you have this big sedimentary unit forming in a basin. At the same time, you have this carbonate forming. So why would we want to understand this carbonate? Well, primarily, we want to know what the depositional context was. We want to know how did it form, what were the environmental conditions. Again, what were the environmental conditions? How did they vary spatially? This is a huge horizon. It's almost a kilometer long. Was it uniform in terms of conditions? And this will dictate whether or not it was habitable and whether or not we'll find any biosignatures there, or organic biomarkers, I should say. So, deposition. Originally in about the 70s, like I said, this has been worked on, it's been mined for 100 years, so a lot of work's been done. People thought that this could have been a synvolcanic chemical exhalative from a seafloor vent system. So basically this. You've got seafloor fluids coming up in probably more of a white smoker system. You're precipitating carbonate, almost like a blanket of carbonate on top of the volcanics. That's why they call it a horizon, a conformable horizon. But more recently we found, this is just a map of the 21st level of the mine. So these are your volcanic sequences. All this green stuff is volcanics. This is a later intrusion, and these are your sediments up top. So you can see these are the mine workings here. And if we overlay the anchorite horizons, here they are, they're pretty much conformable along volcanics, between volcanic flows. But what we've actually found, because there's been so much mining done here, is that there is an anchorite vein that actually cross-cuts the volcanics. So this is some evidence against a seafloor deposition, unless this is just kind of like a conduit. But then also, what's more interesting is there is one horizon that cross-cuts a later intrusion. So this tells us that it's most likely not a seafloor deposition because it cross-cuts something that was in place later. So what are we proposing? Probably syntectonic sub-seafloor deposition. So what you have is a situation kind of like this, where you've got volcanic rocks with some sort of sedimentary cap what I call an aquitard. So the fluids are flowing and they can't get up to the surface. So they're flowing along lithological boundaries between the volcanic layers where there's less competent rock there. So you end up with this seemingly conformable horizon that actually crosscuts. So what we're doing is taking a mine-to-micron approach to understand this anchorite. So basically coming from the mine scale, I'm lucky. I can go underground and see the entire horizon. You can see it cross-cutting different lithologies. So here's the carbonate here. Here's the sediment unit. You can see that. And then taking subsamples, like this one, for instance, the hand sample scale, you can also see paragenetic relationships, like this later cross-cutting quartz vein here. And then looking down to the micron scale, SEM analysis, things like that, carbon and oxygen isotopes. You can tell more about paragenesis, fluid conditions, and fluid source. Because ultimately, we want to understand the mineralogy and geochemistry, because this will allow us to constrain the environmental conditions. So we're taking a multi-scale, multi-technique approach. So this is one technique I'm using, spectroscopy. This would be kind of comparable to CRISM data. This is UV vis near IR. I did this in Ed Clutis' lab in Winnipeg. Just an example of several spectra. So what we see here is we've got this feature here, around 2.5 and 2.3 microns. This is a carbon and oxygen feature. This tells us we have carbonate present. That's what they use to detect carbonate on Mars, too, that same feature. Here we see these iron crystal field transitions. We have an iron-rich carbonate. It's an anchorite. We also see an OH feature here, which tells us we have something hydrated, some sort of water in the crystal lattice of a mineral. And we also have a metal OH feature. Now this is probably, I think, magnesium OH. This tells us we have a mica. This is what they use to detect phyllosilicates on Mars. So we have a carbonate mica assemblage. And then we can also do, this is information that I got from micro X-ray diffraction. So like X-ray diffraction, what was shown earlier, but you can do it in situ. So I did a transect. All these little red dots are spots that I did micro XRD on. And you can see the general mineralogy here. So you've got anchorite or dolomite and some pyrite that's kind of everywhere. I say anchorite / dolomite because they're isostructural, and it's basically can't really tell in XRD which is which. It's just a solid solution series of iron, magnesium, calcium, carbonate. And then you've got a little bit of calcite, but this is one of the few samples that actually has any calcite. Quartz kind of throughout, some mica, so that's a phyllosilicate. And then some different types of sulfides, galena, but then also tourmaline. So this is telling us we have some sort of sedimentary input into the fluid to provide the boron for tourmaline. So we've got multiple fluids. And then down to SEM analysis. So these are backscatter SEM images showing different types of sulfides that we see. So here we've got pyrite and molybdenite. We've got sphalerite, which is a zinc sulfide, some more pyrite, galena, chalcoprites. We've got lead, zinc, copper sulfides. These will all form at different temperatures. We know we have different fluid sources in different temperatures. But what does this all tell us about the geochemistry and the potential habitability? Well, firstly, we have carbonate, sericite, or potassic alteration. This is low salinity, CO2-dominated fluid. So a pretty mundane hydrothermal fluid. But then we see variability in accessory minerals and trace metals. So accessory minerals like different types of sulfide species, rutiles, things like that, and trace metals like titanium, vanadium, chromium, molybdenum, some of which are really important when we talk about metal catalysts for life and enzymes. We also see multiple fluid sources, which partially we attribute some of this trace metal variability to episodic magmatic fluid input. So little pulses of these metal-rich, really interesting fluids into this pretty, just carbonate-rich fluid, providing areas of fluid mixing, which is really interesting. You've got different fluids, different temperatures. You're creating potential for redox gradients and pH gradients, as we know are important for life. So what we're doing now and working on is trying to further understand this fluid source and mixing. So looking at carbon and oxygen stable isotopes, we'll start running them as soon as I get back to London. And then I've done some synchrotron X-ray mapping and speciation of pyrite grains to look at trace metal speciation and abundances and correlations between different trace metals and gold, for instance, and yeah, primarily gold. It's in a mine. The gold company wants to know where the gold is from. But I get to get cool samples and do awesome science. It's kind of like it's a trade-off. And then we want to understand fluid temperatures. This is what I'm excited about. We're going to do some clumped carbonate isotope thermometry. This will allow us to elucidate what temperature this carbonate was precipitated at, and then also to fully understand the timing and paragenesis. The rock record in this area is pretty well understood. A lot of things have been dated. It's been worked on for 100 years. But if we can put this hydrothermal alteration into context with when the basin was forming, what intrusions were forming, we can better understand what's going on the large scale. So we're going to do either some monazite or molybdenite dating. Haven't decided yet. With that, I would like to thank my sponsors and everyone and leave you with this and take some questions.